To the sound of Smetana's mighty Moldau, I wish you welcome to this program. I would like to invite you on a journey to places and times that are mostly forgotten. In 10 episodes, we will explore the early days of the earth. It is so long ago, but yet it's relevant today. If you like, you are welcome to come along. This river Moldau, that is flowing through the Czech Republic, can be seen as a metaphor for the passage of time. We know that the universe has at least 4 dimensions, and there could be more. And the 4th dimension is time itself. It is often thought of as a wide and mighty river that is flowing just like the Moldau. Time passes, and the river cannot be stopped. It follows its own pace from an unknown source to an unknown destination. The philosopher Heraclitus of Ephesus lived 500 years before our era, and he famously said, "No man ever steps into the same river twice, for it's not the same river and he is not the same man." In the same sense, we cannot recover time that we have lost. The people who lived before us are known to us by what the river has brought us, what somebody wrote down. And from earlier times there is even less. The memory has often disappeared along the riverbank. This river, as well as time itself, comes from an unknown source. And I suppose that mankind also once came from this same place, at the beginning of time, when there were only a handful of people, and they were living where the river began, and some would say at the sources of the Euphrates River. So let's go and look for these people. It's a long journey through time, and we shall see if they are like us and if we can learn anything from them. Our journey will consist of a series of 10 programs about our oldest history, from the beginning of what we call historical time. And we will try to find answers to some of the questions that many have asked about this period. It's the part of human history which is described in the book Genesis of the Bible. This is the first program in the series, and I will present a schedule of the whole trip. Our guide on this journey will be the written material from this period, the oldest books known to man. They give us detailed narratives of the earliest period. And the most important of these are, of course, the Bible. It has a unique position and is supposedly the world's most read book. And when we quote from the Bible, we use the New King James translation. We will also get some information from the Book of Jubilees and the Book of the Upright, which is also often called the Book of Jasher. These 2 books have been used in the same religious circles as the Bible for thousands of years without having achieved quite the same position. The Book of Jubilees is sometimes called Lesser Genesis because it covers the same period as Genesis in the Bible, but with more detailed accounts. The scrolls found in the caves at Qumran in 1947 contained several copies of this book, and many of the church fathers quoted from it, and the Ethiopian church counts it among its biblical books even today. The Book of the Upright is mentioned in the Bible, but it's still not quite certain if it's the same book that we have today. And we will also rely on books that the Jewish historian Flavius Josephus wrote in the 1st century. He quotes from several other old books that since have been lost. As a whole, this gives us a wealth of information about an early time that is unknown to most people. Now that we have our sources in place, we are almost ready to start the voyage. But as we begin, we need to ask, when was this early period. Since we travel through time, we need to aim for a certain period. And this we will do in the next episode. Questions about the beginnings and the age of humanity have been debated for hundreds and possibly thousands of years, and there is seldom any agreement. And in our quest we need a reference to go by. To me it seems clear that everything that we see around us, the whole world and the whole universe, must have had a beginning. At one time this all came into existence. It has not been here forever. And both astronomers and physicists agree with me on this. In the next episode, we shall try to find an objective method for estimating the age of the Earth. And when we proceed with our journey, it's best to have at least an approximate date for when the events occurred and when this early civilization existed. Looking all around us, it's easy to imagine that the conditions on the Earth never have changed. But that is not the case. Quite the opposite is true. Many geological discoveries indicate that we may be living in the most peaceful period in the entire history of the Earth. All over our planet there are traces of violent upheavals, where major parts of wildlife and plant life were destroyed. To interpret all of this in a credible and unified way is not easy. The early Earth was full of life, and from fossils we know that most species were just as they are today. In some cases they were much larger, and other species that were common in the beginning have completely disappeared. Mammoths, mastodons and dinosaurs, today they are all extinct. Under chaotic conditions, both large and small animals suffered, and whole schools of fish could perish at once. We find them today as fossils. What kind of event could cause an entire school of fish to perish in a couple of seconds? In many places, ice and water have heaped up piles of remains from animals and plants. And such layers can be hundreds of feet thick and are full of organic material in different states of decomposition. And the fact that the material is still decomposing has led scientists to conclude that it is a result of a fairly recent event. For many years, more than half of the world's consumption of ivory has come from mammoth tusks that have been dug out of the thawed permafrost in Siberia and Alaska. At some of these sites, fossil remains of humans have been found alongside remains from extinct animals. It shows that humans and the extinct animals lived side by side, and it paints a picture of a time when virtually all life on Earth was wiped out at once. In coal mines around the world, out-of-place artifacts have been found from an early civilization that existed when the coal was formed. In 2008, miners in Donetsk in Ukraine found a wagon wheel with spokes many hundred feet underground. In other coal mines, other unexpected objects have been found, including human skulls, a small iron pot, and a gold necklace. Science has become more cautious when estimating the age of coal. Perhaps they realize that their knowledge is limited. We are still often told today that coal was formed over millions of years, but if so, then how can we today find remains of a highly civilized, highly developed civilization embedded in coal half a mile below the surface? The evidence points to a much younger age for the coal. Such discoveries are convincing evidence that humans have been part of our fauna for longer than is often assumed, and fossils show that the different species hardly have changed since then. Now we will consider a few claimed transitional fossils and discuss how to interpret them. The fossil record is only one of several testimonies about the young Earth. Another comes from the study of demographics, the population records of centuries. Some people are concerned today about the consequences of an increasing world population. Starting from the first little group of settlers, the world's population now has reached 7.5 billion. And to call this a population explosion is hardly an exaggeration. The Earth is beginning to fill up. Mankind has done well for itself in a world where they have no natural enemies. In fact, history shows that man's worst enemy is man himself, through wars and other conditions. Without natural enemies, the population has grown constantly and never reached an equilibrium. When we analyze the history of the Earth, there is enough demographic data to determine a time when the first population started with a handful of individuals a few thousand years ago. We often hear that mankind is perhaps as much as 1 million years old, and it is a view that is based on evolutionary theory rather than empirical facts. Ideology can narrow the field of view, and different perspectives may be overlooked, resulting in a faulty conclusion. Publicly available statistics on population growth show clearly how the Earth has been populated, and we may assume that the population 2,000 years ago could have reached 100 million, and at the time of Abraham, 2,000 years earlier, there were probably no more than 20,000 people on the Earth. Now we understand that their situation must have been very different from ours, politically, socially and culturally. The period described by our sources is often called historical time, the last 5,000 to 6,000 years. And this is a sufficiently long period to account for the population growth from the first individuals to the present day situation. If mankind was 1 million years old, there would not be room for us today, even if all were standing. And in the next episode we will give our conclusion about the most likely age of our planet. With this information dialed into our computer, we shall set sail and go to the beginning where everything started. The young Earth must have been one single large and fertile garden, and there was no pollution. Everything was fresh from the hand of the Creator, and He had said that all was well. One place that was particularly nice was called the Garden of Eden by the ancient scriptures, and this is where man first opened his eyes. Life began in a paradise full of new and exciting things. Adam and Eve lived in daily fellowship with their God and Creator, and it was a life that they always yearned to return to later in their lives. The life in God's garden will be the topic of our third episode. But pretty soon, curiosity and selfishness prevailed and caused problems, and the peace in the garden was disturbed, and Adam and Eve had to leave, and life became a struggle. We shall study some of the imagery in this story from the Garden of Eden, the deeper meaning of the two trees, the temptation by the snake, the original sin, and the subsequent expulsion. The story seems to be more than a pious tale, and we shall see what the Church Fathers and others have thought about this. At this point, Adam and Eve were living outside and to the east of the Garden of Eden. They had started a new life on their own. And in the fourth episode, we shall see what is known about the early descendants of Adam and Eve. Before the flood of Noah, 10 generations lived over a period of approximately 1600 years. Now Adam's lineage goes through their son Seth, and the oldest sons are listed in the Bible. Among them we find Enoch, Methuselah, and Noah, names that are well known. The story about Noah will come later when we talk about the Great Flood. In all, we think that we have found some interesting facts about these antediluvial fathers. One of the incredible facts about the people who lived before the flood was that most of them lived to an extremely high age. Some were almost 10 times older than we can ever hope to be. And in one episode we shall check these texts carefully, hoping to find an explanation to a lifespan that goes far beyond our present expectations and, quite frankly, our comprehension. The average lifespan before the flood was 926 years. And how was it possible to attain such an age? Now, the Bible gives us some clues and points to an unexpected answer. When Methuselah became 969 years old, it is not all that incredible in light of what the Bible says, and we shall discuss this in episode 5. Have you ever heard about the Nephilim? They were creatures presented in a story in Genesis, and were a tribe of superhuman giants. They were like other people, only much bigger. In fact, so big that interaction with Adam's descendants was limited. These giants caused famine by eating all the food and even turned to cannibalism. There was a real possibility of self-destruction of mankind. The Hebrew name for these giants is Nephilim, and this is one of the topics that we shall discuss in episode 6. They could get very big, at least 30 feet tall. We don't hear much about them now, and what is written about them is not so easy to understand. If they have existed, there should be some fossil remains that we could find. And it would be interesting to see this, so let's go looking for giant fossils. The Nephilim were blamed for many of the problems during their age, and this affected life all over the earth through the great flood that came. Now, every society may experience moral decay, and according to the Bible it has always been so. Many of the human predicaments will have followed us from the first moment. Abuse and war and jealousy and envy and murder. When religions speak of man being sinful, it has a realistic background. We are no angels. At the end of this period, the earth had become full of evil, and God decided to pass judgment on mankind. Only Noah and his family escaped when the floodgates of the deluge burst open and the world drowned. How can we describe this flood? What caused it, and how was the earth affected? In episode 7 we shall try to understand this event. The flood was truly a worldwide disaster, an event so dramatic that it could easily have wiped out all life on earth. And in the Bible there is an account of this flood which explains some of what took place. We can make speculations about how the event started, but the result was a devastating flood where everything and everyone got submerged. We have all seen how floods can be a daunting and sometimes life-threatening experience. But the flood that the patriarch Noah experienced was on a different level altogether. The ancient scriptures give an account of this flood. It rained for more than a month, causing the water eventually to cover the whole world. There are many cultures in different parts of the world that have preserved ancient legends about this great flood. But how was it possible for the entire earth to be submerged? Today it would take an impossible amount of water to submerge every mountain. And equally mysterious is where all the water went away after the flood subsided. And we will try to answer these questions honestly. And archaeologists and geologists have found many traces of huge flood disasters in the past. And when the Bible gives an eyewitness account of the same event, we do well to listen. The eyewitness was Noah. He was the 10th in Adam's lineage and was 600 years old when this all happened, but he was not senile. He had been warned about an impending danger. The whole world would be flooded. But in a supernatural rescue operation, he learned how his family and a host of animals could survive the flood if they built a big ship. And the Bible calls it an ark. The story about Noah's Ark is known to most, young and old, and lives on in children's books, kindergartens and Sunday schools. But the story is not always easy to understand for adults. And in the 8th episode we shall pay a visit to Noah and his ark. Has it existed, and does it still exist? Also, can we believe the biblical claims that Noah found room in the ark for all the different animal species? The boat was 500 by 100 foot. Many believe that there must have been survivors in various places that were not affected by the flood. But my assumption will be that the biblical account is correct and that the whole world was flooded. And let us see where this leads us. During this flood, the ark drifted in the wind for months before the voyage came to an end. Both the Bible, the Quran, and other scriptures tell us where Noah's ark landed. They use different names on the actual landing site, but agree that it was in a mountain range in the Caucasus called Ararat, on the border between three countries, Turkey, Armenia, and Iran. Many eyewitnesses claim that the ship still exists and has been seen in recent years. And we will look for concrete evidence of the ark's existence. Have any items been found that can be traced back to Noah's ark? And to find the ark itself would probably be the greatest achievement in archaeological history. And more about this in episode 8. Then, in the aftermath of the flood and all the devastation, the people in the ark made a new home for themselves in the rubble. The human race had to re-establish itself, at first near the ark. They were afraid there would be another flood. But slowly they migrated into other parts of the world. And we shall find out where this started. It began with a small agricultural settlement for the first little group of people. And in the 9th episode we shall look for the oldest human settlements, houses and small towns that were built a few thousand years ago. Archaeologists are making new discoveries all the time, so we cannot draw firm conclusions. But one particular region that stands out is the southern Caucasus. Several very early settlements have been found in this area. There were many buildings, and some of which had ceremonial rooms, and we can also see that such settlements migrated to surrounding regions. And one of them is the village of Haran, which was established very early. And the Bible says that Abraham lived here for a while. The recolonization of the earth started with 8 people, and 300 years later, when Abraham was born, the human population counted 20,000 people. Mostly they were living in northern Mesopotamia. The study of these early civilizations and their migrations is the task of anthropologists. Was it here south of the Caucasus, between the rivers of Euphrates and Tigris, that it's all started. It looks that way. And we shall follow some of these migrations and see if we meet anthropologists along the way. Noah had 3 children, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. They represent every man and woman who has ever lived. They experienced the world before the flood, and they now had to begin all over and build the first settlements in a world that was completely destroyed. All of our genes come from Noah's close family. Shem was the ancestor of all the Semitic people, both Arab and Jewish. He settled towards the east. Ham's children settled on the Arabian Peninsula and in Africa, while the children of Japheth settled west and north of Ararat. In the 9th episode, we shall see how this first migration can still be visible through the names of towns and places. This is strong evidence that the story is true. Shem may have been Noah's youngest son, and among his descendants there soon appeared a person who has become a kind of paterfamilias for us all, the farmer Abram, or Abraham as we know him. This man was born almost 60 years before Noah died, and he became the ancestor of most of the Semitic peoples. And through his sons Ishmael and Isaac, and the grandchildren Esau and Jacob, he has influenced the lives and beliefs of many generations until this day. He has been called the friend of God and father of those who believe. And at his birth there were 10 generations of his ancestors who were still alive. Can anybody imagine what it must have been like for so many generations to live together? Abram was born into a small community called Ur of the Chaldeans, and most people in this town had already abandoned their faith in Noah's God and were worshipping the moon god. This happened so soon after the flood that it must have been a form of idol worship that was remembered by somebody in Noah's family from before the flood and brought by them into the new world. Now they were living here between the rivers of Euphrates and Tigris in Mesopotamia and were idolaters. As a little boy, Abram very early stood up against this idolatry and he asked his father to oppose it. But there were no religious freedom in Ur, and any opposition to the king could mean the death penalty. The story about the young Abram we find mainly in the Book of the Upright, and it's told that he came into conflict with King Nimrod and had to flee from the city of Ur together with his family. And then they went to the nearby village of Haran, and later he moved on towards Canaan and received God's calling and guidance in his life. And as Abraham travels to the land of Canaan, the land that God had promised him, we end this story about the family from Eden. The major religions agree up to this point. Judaism, Islam, and the Christian Church. This part of the story unites them. But from here on, they go separate ways and disagree about the ownership to later events. I'm content. This is the final stop on the journey, and we have discussed and shed light on an important part of the earliest history. This is where we all come from. It is how it began. And today it is all ancient history, and if we did not have the old books, we could not have known what it was like to live in those days. Now we know that in many ways they were like us. The experience of being a human, feeling joy, sorrow and pain is not new. This has always been a part of the human experience. and our ancestors were also no less intelligent than we are. The Spanish philosopher George Santayana famously said, "Those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it." And this is why it is very important to keep the old stories alive. And let us assume that the stories are more than legends and see what we can learn from them today. Well, our journey has been defined and we are ready for departure. The next time we shall set sail, and I hope you will join me. See you then.